December 18, 1944. 05:20 hours. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Corporal Robert Hayes sat in a frozen foxhole trying to stop his hands from shaking. Not from cold, from fear. He was 24 years old, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, trained as a combat medic with the 99th Infantry Division. He had been in Belgium for 11 days. In 3 hours, he would make a decision that would destroy his life. In 4 days, he would save 47 enemy soldiers. In 6 weeks, 12 Americans would die because of it. Hayes was not supposed to be in this foxhole. He was supposed to be 2 miles behind the line at a battalion aid station, treating wounded soldiers in relative safety. But the German offensive that started 2 days ago had shattered the American defensive line. His aid station was overrun. He ran. Ended up with a group of 30 infantry soldiers who were surrounded, cut off, out of ammunition, waiting to die or surrender. The foxhole smelled like mud and wet wool, and something rotten Hayes could not identify. Next to him, Private Danny Kowalski, 19 years old from Chicago, kept asking how much longer until they got relieved. Hayes said he did not know. Kowalski said his hands were numb, could not feel his rifle. Hayes told him to keep moving his fingers. Kowalski tried. His fingers barely moved. At 05:47 hours, German artillery started hitting the American position. Shells screamed overhead, detonated 50 yards away, 30 yards, 20 yards. Hayes pressed himself into the bottom of the foxhole, tasted dirt, felt the concussive pressure of each explosion hit his chest like fists. Kowalski was praying out loud in Polish. Hayes could not understand the words, but recognized the tone. Desperation. At 06:03 hours, the shelling stopped. Silence. Then voices. German voices, shouting orders. Hayes looked over the edge of the foxhole, saw shapes moving through the trees. Gray uniforms, helmets. At least 60 soldiers advancing in a skirmish line, rifles ready. The American position had maybe 30 men left. Most were out of ammunition. This was not going to be a fight. This was going to be a massacre or a surrender. The American lieutenant, a 22-year-old from Virginia, whose name Hayes never learned, stood up, raised his hands, shouted, "We surrender," in English. Some of the Americans stood up, raised their hands. The Germans kept advancing. One German soldier, maybe 18 years old, shot the American lieutenant in the chest from 15 feet away. The lieutenant fell backward into the snow. Did not move. The other Americans dropped to the ground, screaming, "Do not shoot," hands still raised. Hayes stayed in his foxhole. Kowalski next to him was frozen, staring at the dead lieutenant, not moving. Hayes whispered, "Stay down, do not move. Maybe they will not see us." Kowalski did not respond, did not blink. Hayes realized the kid was in shock. The Germans moved through the American position, collecting weapons, searching bodies, pulling soldiers out of foxholes. Hayes heard boots crunching in snow getting closer. A German voice shouted something Hayes did not understand. Then a rifle barrel appeared over the edge of the foxhole, pointed at Hayes' face. Hayes looked up, saw a German soldier, maybe 25 years old, eyes hard, finger on the trigger. Hayes raised his hand slowly. The soldier gestured with the rifle. "Get out." Hayes climbed out of the foxhole. Kowalski did not move. The soldier shouted at Kowalski. Kowalski still did not move. The soldier aimed his rifle at Kowalski's head. Hayes said, "Medic, I am a medic. He is in shock." He pointed at the Red Cross armband on his left arm. The German soldier looked at the armband, then at Kowalski, then back at Hayes. Lowered the rifle slightly, shouted something Hayes did not understand. Another German soldier came over. This one was older, maybe 35, had a Red Cross armband on his own uniform. A sanitator, a German medic. The German medic looked at Kowalski, then at Hayes, said in broken English, "You are medic?" Hayes said yes. The German medic knelt next to Kowalski, checked his pulse, his eyes, waved a hand in front of his face. Said to Hayes, "Your friend is shocked. He will be okay." Then he stood up, gestured for Hayes to follow. Hayes did not move. Said, "What about him?" pointing at Kowalski. The German medic said, "He comes with prisoners. You come with me." Hayes said, "I am a prisoner too." The German medic said, "No, you're medic. I need help. You help me." Hayes did not understand. The German medic grabbed Hayes by the arm, pulled him away from the foxhole. Hayes looked back, saw German soldiers pulling Kowalski out, pushing him toward a group of American prisoners being marched east. Kowalski looked at Hayes, eyes wide, terrified. Hayes wanted to go to him. The German medic pulled harder, said, "Come, wounded men need help." They walked 200 yards through the forest to a clearing where the Germans had set up a temporary aid station. Shelter halves stretched between trees, wounded German soldiers lying on the ground, bleeding, groaning, some screaming. Hayes counted at least 20 wounded, maybe more. The German medic pointed at them, said, "I have no help. You help me, or they die." Hayes stared at him. These were enemy soldiers, men who had just killed the American lieutenant, men who had just captured his friends. The German medic said, "Geneva Convention, you are medic, you must help wounded, does not matter what side." Hayes knew he was right. The Geneva Convention required medical personnel to treat all wounded regardless of nationality. Hayes said, "I will help." The German medic nodded, handed him a medical bag, said, "Start with that one," pointing to a soldier with a leg wound, arterial bleeding, blood pooling in the snow. Hayes knelt next to the wounded German, opened the medical bag, found a tourniquet, applied it above the wound, twisted it tight. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. The German soldier looked at Hayes, said something in German Hayes did not understand. Hayes said, "You're going to be okay." The German soldier probably did not understand English, but seemed to relax slightly. Hayes worked for 2 hours, treated 11 wounded Germans, stopped bleeding, dressed wounds, splinted broken bones, administered morphine. The German medic worked next to him, treating other wounded. They did not talk much, did not need to. They both knew what to do. At one point, Hayes ran out of bandages. The German medic handed him more from his own supplies. Hayes said, "Thank you." The German medic said, "You are good medic." Hayes did not know what to say. At 08:20 hours, American artillery started hitting the German position. Shells screamed in, detonated 100 yards away, then closer, 75 yards, 50 yards. The German medic shouted, "Take cover." Hayes and the German medic dragged wounded soldiers under the shelter halves, tried to shield them with their own bodies. A shell hit 30 yards away. The blast threw Hayes forward, his face hit the frozen ground. He tasted blood. His ears rang. He could not hear anything except a high-pitched whine. He rolled over, looked around. The German medic was 10 feet away, lying on his side, not moving. Hayes crawled to him, grabbed his shoulder, shook him. The German medic did not respond. Hayes checked for a pulse. Found one. Weak, but present. He rolled the medic onto his back, saw blood soaking through his uniform on the left side, just below the ribs. Shrapnel. Hayes opened the medic's uniform, saw a jagged wound, bleeding heavily. He pressed his hands against the wound, tried to stop the bleeding. Blood ran between his fingers, warm, sticky. The German medic opened his eyes, looked at Hayes, said in English, "I am dying." Hayes said, "No, you're not dying. I am not letting you die." The German medic smiled slightly, said, "You're a good man." Hayes said, "Shut up, save your energy." He packed the wound with gauze, wrapped it tight with a bandage, tied it off. The bleeding slowed. The German medic said, "Thank you." Hayes said, "You saved my friend from being shot. I am saving you. We are even." Another shell hit closer, 20 yards. The impact threw dirt and snow over both of them. Hayes covered the German medic's body with his own. Felt shrapnel hit his left leg, sharp burning pain, then numbness. He looked down, saw blood spreading through his pants, a piece of metal sticking out of his thigh. He tried to reach for it, could not. His hands were still pressed against the German medic's wound. The shelling stopped. Hayes waited 30 seconds, then carefully moved off the German medic, looked at his own leg. The shrapnel had gone in deep, maybe 4 inches into the muscle. Blood was running down his leg, filling his boot. He reached for his medical bag, realized he had left it 15 feet away when the shelling started. He tried to stand up. His leg gave out. He fell, tried again, fell again. The German medic saw him struggling, said, "You are wounded." Hayes said, "I am fine." The German medic said, "You're not fine. You cannot walk." Hayes said, "I can walk. Just give me a minute." He tried to stand a third time. His vision started going black around the edges. He realized he was losing too much blood. The German medic crawled over to Hayes, said, "Lie down. I will help you." Hayes said, "You are wounded. You need to rest." The German medic ignored him, pulled Hayes onto his back, grabbed the medical bag, opened it, found a tourniquet, applied it to Hayes' leg above the wound, twisted it tight. The bleeding slowed. Then the German medic pulled out a pair of forceps, said, "This will hurt." Hayes said, "Do it." The German medic grabbed the shrapnel with the forceps, pulled. Hayes screamed. The pain was white-hot, filled his entire body. He felt the metal sliding out of his muscle, scraping against bone. Then it was out. The German medic packed the wound with gauze, wrapped it, tied it tight. Said, "You will live." Hayes said, "Thank you." The German medic said, "Now we are even." Hayes lay on the ground, breathing hard, staring at the gray sky. He could not feel his leg any more, could not feel much of anything. The German medic sat next to him, holding his own wound, both of them bleeding, both of them alive, because the other one refused to let them die. Hayes asked the German medic his name. The medic said Franz Weber. Hayes said Robert Hayes. Weber said, "Nice to meet you, Robert." Hayes almost laughed. "Nice to meet you," in the middle of a battlefield, while bleeding out. He said, "Nice to meet you too, Franz." Weber said, "When this is over, maybe we see each other again, have a drink, talk about something other than war." Hayes said, "Maybe." Weber said, "You are a good medic, Robert. You saved many men today, German men, even though they are your enemy." Hayes said, "You saved me, even though I am your enemy." Weber said, "Because we are not enemies, Robert. We are medics. We save lives. That is what we do. Does not matter what uniform." Hayes wanted to respond, but his vision was fading. He felt cold. So cold. "Weber shook him," said Robert. "Stay awake. Do not close your eyes." Hayes tried. Could not. Everything went black. When Hayes woke up, he was in a German field hospital, lying on a cot, his leg bandaged, morphine in his system. A German doctor stood over him, checking his pulse. The doctor said in German accented English, "You are very lucky. You lost a lot of blood, but you will live." Hayes asked, "Where is Weber?" The doctor said, "The other medic?" "He is recovering. He will be fine. He told us to take care of you. Said you saved his life." Hayes said, "He saved mine too." The doctor said, "You are prisoner now. You will be moved to a POW camp when you can walk." Hayes said, "How long?" The doctor said, "Maybe 3 days, maybe a week. Depends on how fast you heal." Hayes asked what happened to the other Americans, the ones who were captured with me. The doctor said they were sent east already to a camp in Germany. Hayes asked about Kowalski. The doctor said, "I do not know names. I only know you because Weber told me about you." Hayes spent 3 days in the German field hospital. Weber was in a cot 10 feet away. They talked when they could. Weber told Hayes about his family in Munich, his wife, his 2 children, how he had been a school teacher before the war, taught history and literature, how he missed it. Hayes told Weber about Pittsburgh, about working in his father's bakery before he enlisted, about how he wanted to go to medical school after the war, become a real doctor, not just a medic. Weber said, "You will be a good doctor, Robert." Hayes said, "You will be a good teacher again, Franz." On the 3rd day, Weber was transferred out, moved to a hospital further behind the German lines. He shook Hayes' hand before he left, said, "I hope we see each other again, Robert, when this is over, when we are not enemies anymore. Hayes said, "I hope so too, Franz." Weber smiled, turned, walked out. Hayes never saw him again, not for 76 years. On December 21, 1944, 3 days after Hayes was captured, American forces counterattacked, retook the position where Hayes had been wounded. The German field hospital was abandoned in the retreat. American soldiers found Hayes lying on a cot, barely able to stand, leg infected, fever of 103 degrees. They loaded him onto a jeep, drove him to an American aid station, pumped him full of penicillin, saved his life for the second time in 3 days. Hayes recovered, returned to duty January 2, 1945, assigned to the 99th Infantry Division Medical Detachment. He asked about Kowalski. Nobody knew where he was. Hayes assumed he was in a POW camp somewhere in Germany, hoped he was alive. On January 4th, Hayes was attached to a rifle company pushing east toward the German border. They moved through a forest, took fire from a German position, called for artillery, then advanced after the shelling stopped. The German position was destroyed. No survivors, except in a basement. Hayes heard moaning, went down the stairs, found 47 wounded German soldiers crammed into a concrete room. No medic, no supplies. Just men bleeding, dying, begging for help in German. Hayes stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring at them. He remembered Weber, remembered Geneva Convention, remembered his oath as a medic, and he made a choice that would destroy everything. January 4th, 1945. 14:20 hours, 3 miles east of the German border. Hayes had been back with his unit for 2 days. His leg still hurt. Every step sent pain shooting up his thigh. The doctor said he should be on light duty for another week. Hayes ignored him. His unit needed medics. Men were dying. He could walk. That was enough. The rifle company he was attached to, Charlie Company, 99th Infantry Division, had been pushing east for 6 days straight, taking villages, clearing forests, fighting through German defensive positions. Casualties were heavy. Hayes had treated 23 wounded soldiers in the last 48 hours, saved 19, lost 4. He remembered every face of the ones who died. At 14:20 hours, Charlie Company took fire from a German position in a cluster of farm buildings 400 yards ahead. Machine guns, maybe a mortar. The company commander, Captain Raymond Morris, 32 years old from Texas, called for artillery. Hayes had met Morris 3 days ago. Morris was hard, did not smile, did not waste words, cared about one thing: completing the mission, getting his men home alive. American 105mm howitzers fired for 8 minutes. Hayes counted 47 shells hitting the German position. The farm buildings disappeared in smoke and fire. When the shelling stopped, Morris ordered the company to advance. Hayes stayed 50 yards behind the lead platoon, medical bag ready, waiting for casualties. The company reached the farm buildings at 14:45 hours. No resistance, no Germans, just rubble, burning wood, smoke. Hayes smelled explosives and something burning that might have been flesh. One of the soldiers, Private Eddie Carson from Alabama, shouted, "There is a basement. I hear voices." Morris walked over, looked down a set of concrete stairs leading underground. Told Carson check it out. Carson went down the stairs, rifle ready. Came back up 30 seconds later, face white. Said, "Sir, you need to see this." Morris went down. Hayes followed. The basement was concrete, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, lit by 2 oil lamps, and it was packed with wounded German soldiers. Hayes counted quickly. 47 men, some lying on the floor, some sitting against the walls, some barely moving, all of them wounded, bleeding, burns, shrapnel, broken bones, missing limbs. The air smelled like blood and infection and human waste. No medic, no supplies, just men waiting to die. Morris stared at them for 10 seconds, then turned to Carson, said, "Get the lieutenant, tell him to bring a squad. We are taking prisoners." Carson ran up the stairs. Morris looked at Hayes, said, "Check them, see if any of them can walk. We need to know how many liters we will need to carry them. Hayes said, "You are taking them prisoner?" Morris said, "Of course I am taking them prisoner. They are enemy combatants. We follow Geneva Convention. We do not execute wounded men." Hayes felt something unclench in his chest. Said, "Yes, sir." Started moving through the basement, checking each German soldier, assessing wounds. The first soldier Hayes checked had burns covering 40% of his body, face blackened, hands fused into claws. He was unconscious, breathing shallow, maybe 6 hours left. Hayes moved to the next one. Leg wound, arterial bleeding, tourniquet applied, but blood still seeping. Maybe 12 hours. Next one. Gut wound, septic, fever, maybe 24 hours. Hayes kept moving, kept checking, kept counting. Out of 47 men, maybe 15 could survive if they got treatment in the next few hours. The rest were going to die. Then Hayes saw him, in the back corner of the basement, sitting with his back against the wall, face pale, uniform soaked in blood. Franz Weber. Hayes stopped, stared, could not believe it. Weber looked up, saw Hayes, smiled weakly, said, "Robert, I knew you would come back." Hayes felt his hands shaking. Said Franz, "What happened? How did you get here?" Weber said, "Artillery hit the aid station I was working at. I was wounded. My unit retreated, left me here with the others. No medic, no supplies. We have been waiting 18 hours. Hayes knelt next to Weber, checked his wounds. Shrapnel in the abdomen. Deep, infected, fever. Weber needed surgery in the next 6 hours, or he would die. Hayes said, "You need a hospital." Weber said, "I know." Then he looked at Hayes, said, "Robert, can you help us?" Hayes said, "I am going to try." Morris came over, saw Hayes kneeling next to Weber, said, "This one a friend of yours?" Hayes said, "Yes, sir. He saved my life when I was captured. He is a medic. Geneva Convention protects him." Morris said, "I do not care who he is. Check the rest. I need a count." Hayes said, "Yes, sir." At 15:20 hours, the company lieutenant, a 23-year-old from Michigan, came down the stairs with a squad of soldiers. Morris told him, "We have 47 German wounded, maybe 15 salvageable, rest are going to die. We need to figure out how to transport them." The lieutenant said, "Sir, we do not have 47 litters. We do not have transport. We barely have enough for our own casualties." Morris said, "Then we carry them on blankets, on doors, on whatever we can find. We are not leaving wounded men to die." The lieutenant said, "Yes, sir." Then a runner came down the stairs, said, "Captain, battalion on the radio, they need you topside." Morris went up. Hayes kept working, started applying fresh bandages to the Germans who had the best chance of survival, trying to stabilize them for transport. Morris came back down 5 minutes later. His face was different, harder. He walked over to Hayes, said, "Medic, stop what you're doing." Hayes looked up, said, "Sir?" Morris said, "We are moving out. Battalion orders. German counterattack forming 2 miles east. We need to reposition. We leave in 20 minutes. Hayes said, "What about the prisoners?" Morris said, "We are leaving them." Hayes stood up, said, "Sir, Geneva Convention requires us to provide medical care to wounded enemy combatants." Morris said, "Geneva Convention also does not require us to risk American lives transporting enemy wounded. When we are facing an imminent attack, we are leaving them. That is an order." Hayes said, "Sir, half of these men will die in the next 12 hours without treatment." Morris said, "Then they die. Get your gear. We move in 15 minutes. Hayes said, "I am staying." Morris stopped, turned around, stared at Hayes, said, "You are what?" Hayes said, "I am staying here. These men need a medic. I am a medic. Geneva Convention requires me to treat them." Morris said, "You are an American soldier. You follow American orders. You are coming with us." Hayes said, "No, sir, I am not." Morris walked up to Hayes, got 6 inches from his face, said, "Let me make this very clear, Corporal. If you disobey my direct order, I will have you court-martialed. You will spend the rest of the war in a military prison. Do you understand me?" Hayes said, "Yes, sir, I understand, and I am still staying." Morris said, "Why? These are Germans. They were trying to kill us 6 hours ago. Why the hell do you care if they live or die?" Hayes said, "Because one of them saved my life when he did not have to. Because I am a medic, and this is what medics do. We save lives. It does not matter what uniform they are wearing." Morris said it matters when American soldiers need you, and you are not there. Hayes said, "My duty is to treat wounded, all wounded. That is the oath I took." Morris said, "Your duty is to follow orders." Morris and Hayes stared at each other for 10 seconds. Then Morris said, "Fine, you want to stay with the Germans, you stay with the Germans, but when you are sitting in a stockade waiting for your court-martial, remember this conversation. Remember you chose enemy soldiers over your own men." Morris turned, walked up the stairs, shouted, "Lieutenant, get the men moving. We leave the Germans. We take nothing. We move out now." The American soldiers left. Hayes heard boots on the stairs, voices fading, then silence. He was alone in the basement with 47 dying Germans. "Weber looked at him," said Robert. "You did not have to do this." Hayes said, "Yes, I did." Hayes worked for 18 hours. He had one medical bag, limited supplies, no morphine, no sulfa powder, no plasma, just gauze, bandages, a few tourniquets, forceps, a scalpel. He stopped bleeding, cleaned wounds, splinted broken bones, amputated 3 limbs that were too far gone to save, worked by the light of 2 oil lamps that kept flickering, threatening to go out. The German soldiers watched him. Some were conscious, some were not. The ones who could speak asked him questions in German. Hayes did not understand most of it, but he understood the tone. Confusion, gratitude. "Why are you helping us?" Hayes did not have an answer they would understand. He just kept working. At 03:40 hours, January 5th, one of the Germans died. Burns too severe. Hayes had done everything he could. It was not enough. The soldier died quietly, stopped breathing, eyes open. Hayes closed his eyes, moved to the next patient. At 06:20 hours, another one died. Gut wound, septic, fever. Gone. Hayes kept working. Weber was getting worse. Fever spiking, infection spreading. He needed surgery Hayes could not provide. Hayes did what he could, packed the wound with clean gauze, gave him water, tried to keep him comfortable. Weber said, "Robert, if I die, tell my wife I tried to come home." Hayes said, "You are not dying. I will not let you die." Weber smiled, said, "You are stubborn." Hayes said, "I learned from the best." At 08:30 hours, Hayes heard vehicles, American voices. He went to the top of the stairs, looked out, saw American medics and stretcher bearers. A major walked over, said, "Corporal, Captain Morris radioed battalion, said there are German wounded here that need evacuation. Are you the medic who stayed?" Hayes said, "Yes, sir." The major said, "How many are still alive?" Hayes said, 31 out of 47. I lost 16. The major said, "You saved 31 in 18 hours with one medical bag. That is damn good work. We are going to evacuate them to a POW hospital. You did the right thing." Hayes did not feel like he did the right thing. He felt exhausted, numb, empty. They loaded the 31 surviving Germans onto trucks. Weber was last. He grabbed Hayes' hand as they lifted him onto a stretcher, said, "Thank you, Robert. You saved my life again. Maybe someday I can repay you." Hayes said, "You already did." Weber was driven away. Hayes never saw him again. Not for 76 years. The major told Hayes to get in a jeep. They were driving him back to his unit. Hayes said, "Where is Charlie Company?" The major said, "They are 8 miles east. They hit heavy resistance yesterday, took casualties. Your aid station was overrun. They needed medics." Hayes felt his chest tighten. Said, "How many casualties?" The major said, 19 wounded. 12 died before they could get treatment. Your battalion medic was hit. No one else was trained. They did what they could, but it was not enough. Hayes said, 12 died? The major said, yes. Hayes said, who? The major pulled out a list, read names. Hayes listened, heard names he recognized, soldiers he had treated before, men he knew. Then the major said, Private Daniel Kowalski. Hayes stopped breathing. The major kept reading. Hayes did not hear the rest. All he heard was Kowalski, 19 years old, from Chicago, prayed in Polish. The kid Hayes had tried to protect in the foxhole on December 18th. The kid who had been captured with him. The kid who had survived. Until yesterday, while Hayes was saving Germans. Hayes said, "How did Kowalski die?" The major said, "Shrapnel wound to the leg, severed artery, bled out in 20 minutes. Medic might have saved him, but there was no medic available. Everyone was spread too thin." Hayes said, "I could have saved him." The major said, "You were following orders to treat wounded prisoners." Hayes said, "I disobeyed orders. I stayed with the Germans by choice. If I had gone with my unit, Kowalski would be alive." The major said, "You did not know there would be casualties." Hayes said, "There are always casualties. That is war. I chose Germans over Americans, and 12 men died because of it." The major said, "You chose to follow Geneva Convention and your oath as a medic. That is not a crime." Hayes said, "Tell that to Kowalski mother." The major drove Hayes back to Charlie Company. Captain Morris was waiting. He looked at Hayes, said, "Welcome back, Corporal. I hope your Germans were worth it." Hayes did not respond. Morris said, "I filed a report on your disobedience. You will be facing a court-martial as soon as we are out of combat operations. Until then, you are confined to the aid station. You do not leave without my permission. You do not treat anyone without my approval. You are under guard. Do you understand?" Hayes said, "Yes, sir." Morris walked away. Hayes stood there, staring at nothing. One of the other soldiers, a sergeant Hayes knew, walked over, said, "I heard what you did, staying with the Germans. A lot of guys are pissed. They think you care more about the enemy than your own men." Hayes said, "Maybe I do." The sergeant said, "Kowalski was my friend. He bled out asking for you, kept saying, 'Where is the medic? Where is Hayes?' And you were not there because you were saving Germans. How do you live with that?" Hayes said, "I do not know." The sergeant walked away. Hayes went to the aid station, sat down, stared at his hands. They were still covered in dried blood. German blood, American blood. He could not tell the difference. That night, Hayes wrote a letter he would never send. To Kowalski mother, trying to explain, trying to justify, trying to make sense of a choice that had no sense. He wrote 4 pages, crossed out every word, burned the letter, wrote nothing. In 6 weeks, Hayes would stand trial. In 6 months, he would be acquitted and dishonored. In 6 years, he would meet Kowalski mother, and she would say words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. February 14th, 1945. 0900 hours. United States Army Court-Martial Facility, Reims, France. Corporal Robert Hayes sat at a wooden table in a cold room that smelled like cigarette smoke and old paper. He wore a clean uniform. His hands were folded on the table. He stared at nothing. In 10 minutes, his court-martial would begin. In 3 hours, his life would be decided by 7 officers who had never been in his position, never made his choice, never saved 31 enemy soldiers, while 12 of their own men died. Hayes had been confined to quarters for 6 weeks, not allowed to treat patients, not allowed to leave the base, not allowed to speak to anyone except his defense attorney. He spent those 6 weeks thinking about Kowalski, about the 11 other Americans who died, about the 31 Germans who lived. He did the math over and over. 31 lives saved, 12 lives lost. Was that a good trade? Was that math a medic should be doing? His defense attorney, Captain James Reynolds, 34 years old, lawyer from Boston before the war, sat next to him. Reynolds had spent 4 weeks preparing the defense. He told Hayes the case was complicated. Geneva Convention clearly required medical personnel to treat all wounded. But military regulations also required soldiers to follow orders. Hayes did one, violated the other. The court had to decide which was more important. Reynolds said Hayes had a good chance of acquittal. The law was on his side. Hayes said the law does not bring Kowalski back. Reynolds said no, it does not, but it might keep you out of prison. Hayes said, "Maybe I belong in prison." Reynolds told him to never say that again, especially not in the courtroom. At 09:10 hours, the court-martial began. 7 officers sat at a long table. The senior officer, Colonel Thomas Bradford, 52 years old, 28 years in the Army, combat veteran of World War I, acted as judge. 6 other officers, ranks from captain to lieutenant colonel, served as jury. All of them had combat experience. All of them had lost men under their command. All of them looked at Hayes like he was something they could not understand. The prosecutor, Major Harold Wallace, 41 years old, from Virginia, former district attorney, stood up to make his opening statement. He was tall, thin, voice sharp. He said this case is simple. Corporal Hayes disobeyed a direct order from his commanding officer during combat operations. That is a court-martial offense under Article 90 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The fact that he disobeyed the order to help enemy soldiers makes it worse. 12 American soldiers died because Corporal Hayes chose Germans over his own men. That is not medicine. That is betrayal. Reynolds objected. Said Hayes did not betray anyone. He followed Geneva Convention and his oath as a medic. Wallace said Geneva Convention does not override military orders. Reynolds said it does when the orders violate international law. Bradford told both of them to sit down. He would decide what the law says. Wallace called his first witness, Captain Raymond Morris. Morris walked to the witness stand, was sworn in, sat down. He did not look at Hayes. Wallace asked Morris to describe what happened on January 4th. Morris said, "We captured a German position, found 47 wounded enemy combatants in a basement. I ordered my unit to prepare to transport them as prisoners per Geneva Convention. Then I received orders from battalion to move out immediately. Due to enemy counterattack, I ordered Corporal Hayes to come with us. He refused. I told him he would be court-martialed if he disobeyed. He refused again. I left him there." Wallace asked, "Did you give Corporal Hayes a direct order to leave with the unit?" Morris said yes. Wallace asked, "Did he disobey that order?" Morris said yes. Wallace asked, "Did you make it clear this was a lawful order?" Morris said yes. I told him multiple times. Wallace said no further questions. Reynolds stood up for cross-examination. Asked Morris, "Did you believe the 47 German wounded should be abandoned to die?" Morris said, "I believed American lives took priority over enemy lives when we were facing an imminent attack." Reynolds said, "But Geneva Convention requires medical care for all wounded, regardless of nationality. Correct?" Morris said yes, under normal circumstances, but these were not normal circumstances. We were in combat. Reynolds said, "So you ordered Corporal Hayes to violate Geneva Convention." Morris said, "I ordered him to follow my command," which he failed to do. Reynolds asked, "How many American casualties did your unit sustain on January 4th and 5th? Morris said, 19 wounded, 12 killed. Reynolds asked, "Do you blame Corporal Hayes for those deaths?" Morris hesitated, then said yes. If Hayes had been with us, some of those men might have lived. Reynolds asked, "Which ones?" Morris said, "I cannot say for certain, but our battalion medic was hit. We had no trained medical personnel. Men bled out waiting for help. Hayes could have saved them." Reynolds asked, "Could have or would have?" Morris said, "I believe he would have." Reynolds asked, "You believe, but you do not know?" Morris said, "No one can know what would have happened." Reynolds asked one more question. "If you were wounded and the only medic available was a German, would you want him to help you?" Morris stared at Reynolds. Didn't answer for 10 seconds. Then said, "That is not relevant." Reynolds said, "It is absolutely relevant, because that is what happened to Corporal Hayes in December. A German medic saved his life, and on January 4th, Hayes returned that debt." Morris said, "Returning a debt to one man does not justify letting 12 others die." Reynolds said, "It does if you follow your oath as a medic." No further questions. Wallace called his second witness. Sergeant Michael Donovan, 27 years old, from Ohio, was in Charlie Company on January 4th. Wallace asked Donovan to describe the casualties. Donovan said Private Kowalski took shrapnel to the leg, femoral artery severed. He bled out in 20 minutes, kept asking, "Where is Hayes? Where is the medic?" We tried to stop the bleeding, but we did not know how. He died asking for help that never came. Wallace asked if a trained medic had been present. Could Private Kowalski have been saved? Donovan said yes. Stopping arterial bleeding is basic field medicine. Any medic could have done it in 5 minutes. Wallace said, but Corporal Hayes was not there because he was treating Germans. Donovan said yes. Wallace asked, "How did that make you feel?" Donovan said like Hayes cared more about the enemy than his own men. Wallace said no further questions. Reynolds did not cross-examine. There was nothing to ask. Kowalski died because Hayes was not there. That was a fact. Wallace called his third witness, Corporal Thomas Grayson, 23 years old, from Texas, also in Charlie Company. Wallace asked Grayson how morale was affected when the men learned Hayes stayed with the Germans. Grayson said everyone was angry, felt betrayed. "We are out here fighting and dying, and our own medic chooses to save the people trying to kill us. It does not make sense. It makes you wonder if you can trust anyone." Reynolds cross-examined. Asked Grayson, "Do you know what the Geneva Convention says about medical personnel?" Grayson said no. Reynolds said it requires medics to treat all wounded without discrimination, enemy and ally alike. Do you think medics should violate that? Grayson said, "I think medics should be where American soldiers need them." Reynolds said, "Even if it means violating international law?" Grayson said, "I do not care about international law. I care about my friends staying alive." Reynolds said no further questions. At 12:20 hours, Wallace rested his case. Bradford called a recess for lunch. Hayes did not eat. Sat in a holding room staring at the wall. Reynolds came in, said the prosecution made a strong case, but we have Geneva Convention on our side. The law is clear. You had a duty to treat those wounded. Hayes said Kowalski had a duty to not die at 19 years old. I failed him. Reynolds said you did not fail him. You made a choice in an impossible situation. Hayes said, "Tell that to his mother." Reynolds froze. Said, "What did you say?" Hayes said, "Kowalski mother, she is here. I saw her in the courtroom, sitting in the back. She has been staring at me for 3 hours. Reynolds said, "Jesus, I did not know she was coming. Wallace must have brought her." Hayes said, "It does not matter who brought her. She is here, and she knows I let her son die." At 1400 hours, the trial resumed. Wallace called his final witness, Margaret Kowalski, 47 years old, from Chicago, mother of Private Daniel Kowalski. She walked to the witness stand slowly, wore a black dress, her face pale, eyes red. She was sworn in, sat down, looked directly at Hayes. He could not look back. Wallace asked Mrs. Kowalski to describe her son. She said Danny was 19 years old. He enlisted when he turned 18, wanted to serve his country, wrote me letters every week, talked about coming home, getting married, having a family. He was a good boy. He did not deserve to die. Her voice broke. She stopped talking. The courtroom was silent. Wallace asked Mrs. Kowalski if she knew how her son died. She said, "Yes, I was told he bled to death from a shrapnel wound because there was no medic available." Wallace said, "Were you told why there was no medic available?" She said, "Yes, because Corporal Hayes chose to stay with German soldiers instead of American soldiers." Wallace asked, "How did that make you feel?" Mrs. Kowalski looked at Hayes, said it made me feel like my son did not matter, like his life was worth less than the enemy, like the man who was supposed to save him decided someone else was more important. Her voice was shaking. She said, "I do not understand how a medic can choose to let his own men die. I do not understand how Danny bled out calling for help that never came. I do not understand why Corporal Hayes thinks German lives are worth more than my son." Wallace said, "Do you believe Corporal Hayes is responsible for your son's death?" Mrs. Kowalski said yes. "I do. If he had been there, Danny would be alive. He was not there. Danny is dead. That is Corporal Hayes' fault." Wallace said no further questions. Sat down. Reynolds stood up, said, "Mrs. Kowalski, I am deeply sorry for your loss. I cannot imagine your pain." She did not respond. Reynolds said, "I have to ask you some difficult questions. Is that okay?" She nodded. Reynolds said, "Do you know what the Geneva Convention is?" She said no. Reynolds explained, "It is an international law that requires medical personnel to treat all wounded soldiers without discrimination, enemy or ally. It was created to prevent medics from being forced to let people die based on which side they fight for." Mrs. Kowalski said, "I do not care about international law. I care about my son." Reynolds said, "I understand, but if the situation were reversed, if Danny had been wounded and captured by Germans, would you want a German medic to help him even if it meant disobeying orders?" Mrs. Kowalski said, "Yes, of course." Reynolds said, "That is what Corporal Hayes did. He helped wounded soldiers because that is what medics are supposed to do." Mrs. Kowalski said, "But they were the enemy." Reynolds said, "Does that mean they should be left to die?" Mrs. Kowalski said, "I do not know. All I know is my son is dead and Corporal Hayes is alive, and that is not fair." Reynolds said, "You are absolutely right. It is not fair. War is not fair, and Corporal Hayes has to live with that choice for the rest of his life." Mrs. Kowalski said, "Good, he should." Reynolds said no further questions. Mrs. Kowalski stepped down, walked past Hayes without looking at him, left the courtroom. Hayes felt like his chest was caving in. Reynolds called Hayes to the stand. Hayes was sworn in, sat down. Reynolds asked him to explain what happened on January 4th. Hayes described finding the 47 Germans, seeing Franz Weber, being ordered to leave, refusing, working for 18 hours, learning that 12 Americans died, including Kowalski. Reynolds asked, "Why did you refuse the order?" Hayes said, "Because those men needed a medic, and I am a medic. Geneva Convention requires me to treat wounded, regardless of what side they are on." Reynolds asked, "Did you know American soldiers might be wounded while you were gone?" Hayes said yes. Reynolds asked, "Did you think about that when you made your choice?" Hayes said yes. "I thought about it. I knew there was a risk, but I also knew if I left those 47 Germans, they would all die. I thought the battalion medic could handle American casualties. I was wrong." Reynolds asked if you could go back and change your decision, would you? Hayes hesitated. Everyone in the room leaned forward. He said, "I do not know." Reynolds said, "You do not know?" Hayes said, "I saved 31 men. They are alive because I stayed. If I had left, they would be dead. But Kowalski is dead because I stayed. I do not know which choice is right. All I know is people died either way, and I have to live with that." Wallace cross-examined. Said Corporal Hayes, "You took an oath when you enlisted, correct?" Hayes said yes. Wallace said that oath included following orders from superior officers, correct? Hayes said yes. Wallace said you violated that oath on January 4th. Hayes said, "I also took an oath as a medic to treat wounded without discrimination. I followed that oath." Wallace said you cannot follow both oaths when they conflict. You have to choose, and you chose the enemy over your own men. Hayes said, "I chose to save lives. That is what medics do." Wallace said, "You chose to save enemy lives while American lives were lost. That is not what medics do. That is what traitors do." Reynolds objected. Bradford sustained the objection, told Wallace to rephrase. Wallace said, "Let me ask this simply. Do you believe 31 German lives are worth more than 12 American lives?" Hayes said, "No." Wallace said, "Then why did you make that trade?" Hayes said, "I did not know it was a trade. I thought I could save the Germans and American casualties would be handled. I was trying to save everyone." Wallace said, "But you did not save everyone. You saved 31 Germans and 12 Americans died." Hayes said, "Yes." Wallace said, "Do you regret your choice?" Hayes said, "Every day." Wallace said, "But you just testified you do not know if you would change it." Hayes said, "Because I do not know if the alternative would have been better. Maybe I go with my unit and all 47 Germans die. Maybe I get killed and cannot save anyone. Maybe Kowalski still dies because I cannot get to him in time. I do not know. All I know is I made the best choice I could with the information I had, and people died because of it." Wallace said no further questions. At 17:20 hours, both sides gave closing statements. Wallace said this case is about duty, discipline, and the chain of command. When a soldier disobeys orders during combat, people die. Corporal Hayes disobeyed orders. 12 Americans died. The law is clear. He must be held accountable. Reynolds said this case is about international law, medical ethics, and impossible choices. Geneva Convention requires medics to treat all wounded. Corporal Hayes followed that law. He saved 31 lives. He did his duty as a medic, even when it cost him everything. The 7 officers deliberated for 2 hours. At 19:20 hours, they returned. Bradford read the verdict. On the charge of disobeying a direct order in a combat zone, we find the defendant, Corporal Robert Hayes, guilty. However, we also find that the order conflicted with his obligations under the Geneva Convention. Therefore, while he is guilty of disobedience, the disobedience was legally justified. The sentence is reduction in rank to private, forfeiture of 6 months' pay, and transfer to non-combat medical duties for the remainder of the war. This court-martial is concluded. Hayes was guilty and justified, both at the same time. He won the trial, lost everything else. Outside the courtroom, reporters surrounded him, asked if he felt vindicated. Hayes said no, asked if he would do it again. Hayes said, "I do not know," asked what he would say to the families of the 12 dead Americans. Hayes said, "I am sorry." That was all he could say. That night, Hayes sat alone in his quarters, thought about Mrs. Kowalski, thought about Weber, thought about the 31 Germans who lived, thought about the 12 Americans who died, tried to do the math, could not make it work. 31 minus 12 equals 19 lives saved, but it did not feel like saving. It felt like losing. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The war in Europe was over. Hayes was in a field hospital in southern Germany, treating displaced persons, refugees, former concentration camp survivors. He had spent the last 3 months in non-combat positions per his court-martial sentence, treating people who needed help, saving lives, not thinking about the 12 who died. Except he thought about them every day. Every patient he treated, he wondered if this was worth Kowalski, if saving this person justified letting that person die. The math never worked. It never would. Hayes returned to the United States in August 1945, discharged honorably despite the court-martial. Reduction in rank meant nothing anymore. The war was over. He went home to Pittsburgh. His family asked what he did during the war. He said he was a medic. They asked if he saved lives. He said yes. They did not ask how many. He did not tell them about the 12 he did not save. Hayes enrolled in medical school in September 1946 using the GI Bill, University of Pittsburgh. He wanted to be a doctor, a real doctor, not a combat medic making impossible choices. He studied hard, did not talk to other veterans, did not join veteran organizations, did not go to reunions. He wanted to forget, could not. In his first year of medical school, Hayes' anatomy professor, Dr. Martin Keller, asked the class a hypothetical question. You are a doctor with limited supplies. 2 patients need immediate treatment. One is your countryman, one is an enemy soldier. Both will die without help. You can only save one. Who do you choose? The class debated. Most said, save your countryman. Loyalty to your own people matters. Some said, save whoever is more likely to survive. Medical triage. A few said, save both somehow. Find a way. Hayes sat silent. The professor noticed. Asked Hayes, what do you think? Hayes said, I think the question is unfair. The professor said, why? Hayes said, because it assumes you know the outcome. In reality, you never know. You make a choice based on incomplete information, and people die because of it, and you live with that forever. The professor said that is a pessimistic view. Hayes said that is a realistic view. The professor moved on. Hayes never spoke in that class again. Hayes graduated medical school in 1950, became a general practitioner, opened a small clinic in Pittsburgh, treated everyone who walked through the door, did not ask about ability to pay, did not discriminate, saved lives, kept working, kept trying to balance the math that would never balance. In 1953, Hayes received a letter, no return address, postmarked Munich, Germany. Inside, a single page handwritten in English. Robert. I hope this letter finds you. I have been trying to find you for 8 years. I learned you were court-martialed for staying with us. I am sorry. I did not know that would happen. I want you to know that because of you, 31 men went home to their families. I went home to my wife and children. My oldest son is named Robert. After you. You gave me my life back. I wish I could give you yours. But I know you carry a weight I cannot lift. I think about you often. I hope you are well. Franz Weber. Hayes read the letter 10 times, wrote a response, threw it away, wrote another, threw it away, never sent anything. What could he say? Thank you for surviving while Kowalski died? He put the letter in a drawer, did not look at it again for 40 years. In 1956, Hayes was working late at his clinic. A patient came in. Woman, 50s, looked familiar. She sat down, said, "Do you remember me?" Hayes looked at her. His chest tightened. Margaret Kowalski. She said, "I came to Pittsburgh to visit family. Someone told me you have a clinic here. I wanted to see you." Hayes said, "I'm sorry. I did not know you would be here." She said, "I know. I came because I wanted to talk to you." Hayes said, "I understand if you do not want me to treat you." She said, "No, I want you to treat me. That is why I am here." She was sick, lung infection, probably pneumonia. Hayes examined her, listened to her breathing, heard the rattle in her chest, said, "You need antibiotics, rest, fluids." She said, "Will I be okay?" Hayes said, "Yes, if you follow the treatment." She said, "Are you a good doctor?" Hayes said, "I try to be." She said, "Did you become a doctor because of what happened?" Hayes stopped, looked at her, said yes. She said, "Good. Danny wanted to be a doctor too. Did you know that?" Hayes said no. She said, "He wrote me letters, talked about going to medical school after the war, helping people, saving lives." She started crying. Hayes handed her a tissue. She said, "Thank you." Hayes wrote her a prescription, gave her instructions. She stood up to leave, then turned back, said, "I have spent 11 years hating you, blaming you for Danny dying. I told myself if you had been there, he would be alive. And maybe that is true. Maybe he would be. But I also know you saved 31 other mothers from losing their sons. And I have been thinking about that, trying to understand if that makes it okay." Hayes said, "Does it?" She said, "No, it does not make it okay. Danny is still dead, but it also means 31 families did not go through what I went through. And I do not know how to feel about that. I do not know if I should thank you or hate you. I think I do both." Hayes said, "I do both too." She said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I did the right thing according to the law, and the wrong thing according to you, and I do not know which one matters more." She said, "Maybe they both matter. Maybe there is no right answer. Maybe you just did what you thought was best, and people died, and people lived, and that is war." Hayes said, "Is that forgiveness?" She said, "No. It is understanding. I understand why you did it, but I will never forgive you for it, and I think you will never forgive yourself." She walked out. Hayes sat in his clinic for an hour, staring at the wall. She was right. He would never forgive himself, not because he was wrong, because there was no right answer. Hayes practiced medicine for 40 years, saved thousands of lives, never forgot the 12. In 1990, he retired, closed his clinic, moved to a small town in Pennsylvania, lived quietly, did not talk about the war, did not talk about the court-martial, did not talk about Kowalski. In 2020, Hayes was 96 years old, living in an assisted living facility. His mind was sharp, his body was failing. A nurse told him he had a visitor, an old man. German accent. Hayes said, "I do not know any Germans." The nurse said, "He says he knows you. His name is Franz Weber." Hayes' hands started shaking. He said, "Send him in." Weber walked in. 96 years old, used a cane, face lined with age, but his eyes were the same. He saw Hayes, smiled, said, "Robert, it has been 76 years. Hayes stood up, walked over. They embraced, both of them crying. Weber said, "I have been trying to find you for decades. After the war, I wrote letters. They were returned. I thought maybe you died. Then last year, my grandson, he is good with computers. He found your name in a newspaper article about retired doctors in Pennsylvania. I flew here yesterday. I had to see you before one of us dies." Hayes said, "I got your letter in 1953. I never responded. I am sorry." Weber said, "Why did you not respond?" Hayes said, "Because I did not know what to say. You survived. 30 others survived, but 12 Americans died, including a 19-year-old kid who prayed in Polish. I saved you and he died. I did not know how to tell you that felt like a good trade." Weber sat down, said, "Robert, you did not trade his life for mine. You made a choice to help wounded men. That is what medics do." Hayes said, "I disobeyed orders. 12 men died because I was not there." Weber said, 31 men lived because you were there. Which number matters more?" Hayes said, "I have been asking that question for 76 years. I still do not have an answer." Weber said, "I have an answer. Both numbers matter. 12 families lost someone. 31 families did not. Both are true. You cannot erase one to justify the other. You did what you thought was right. People died. People lived. That is all any of us can do." Hayes said, "Do you think I was right?" Weber said, "I think you were human. You made a choice in an impossible situation. The law said you were justified. The families of the dead said you were wrong. I say you saved my life. All of those things are true at the same time." Hayes said, "I met Kowalski mother in 1956. She said she understood why I did it, but would never forgive me." Weber said, "Did you forgive yourself?" Hayes said, "No." Weber said, "Why not?" Hayes said, "Because Kowalski was 19 years old, and he died calling my name, and I was not there. How do I forgive myself for that?" Weber said, "You do not. You carry it. That is the cost of the choice you made. You saved 31 men, and you carry 12 deaths. That is not fair. But war is not fair. Healing is not fair. You cannot save everyone, and the ones you do not save will haunt you forever. But the ones you do save get to live. My son Robert is 67 years old. He has 3 children. They exist because you stayed. Kowalski never had children. That is the math. It is terrible math. But it is the only math we have." Hayes said, "I have spent 76 years wishing I could go back and change it." Weber said, "Would you?" Hayes said, "I do not know. If I leave with my unit, all 47 of you die. If I stay, 12 Americans die. I do not know which choice kills fewer people. I do not know if I would make the same choice again. I do not know if that makes me a good doctor or a bad soldier or a coward or a hero. I just know I did what I thought was right and people died." Weber said, "Then you did all you could do. The rest is not your fault. It is war's fault." Hayes said, "That does not make it easier." Weber said, "No, it does not. But maybe it makes it survivable." They sat together for 3 hours, talked about their lives, their families, the 76 years since they last saw each other. When Weber left, he hugged Hayes, said, "Thank you, Robert, for everything, for saving me, for carrying the weight, for being the kind of man who chooses to save lives even when it destroys his own." Hayes said, "I am not sure I am that man." Weber said, "You are. That is why it still hurts." Franz Weber died 6 months later in Munich. Heart failure. He was 97 years old. His family contacted Hayes, told him Franz talked about him often, called him the man who gave him a second life. Hayes went to the funeral, met Weber's children and grandchildren. They thanked him. He did not know what to say. Robert Hayes died on January 4, 2021. He was 97 years old. 76 years to the day after he found 47 wounded Germans in a basement and made a choice that would define the rest of his life. His obituary mentioned he was a decorated combat medic in World War II and a beloved doctor for 40 years. It did not mention the court-martial. It did not mention the 12 dead Americans. It did not mention the 31 saved Germans. It just said he dedicated his life to saving others. At his funeral, his family found a letter in his papers, addressed to Private Kowalski, never sent, written in 1945. It said, "I am sorry I was not there. I was trying to save people who would have died without me. I did not know you needed me. I did not know you would die calling my name. I have carried your death for my entire life. I do not know if what I did was right. I only know I did what I thought a medic should do. I hope that means something. I hope you would understand. I am sorry." The question was never answered. Was Hayes right to stay with the Germans? The law said yes. Kowalski mother said no. Weber said both. Hayes said he did not know. And 76 years later, no one could say with certainty which answer was true. Maybe that is the only truth. Some choices do not have right answers. They only have consequences. 31 men lived. 12 men died. Hayes carried both for 76 years. And in the end, all he could do was hope that the ones he saved made it worth the ones he could not.